Today we're saluting the Sultan of Sarcasm himself, the Maestro of Mayhem, the one and only Dan Soder, a comedian who makes George Carlin feel like Mr. Rogers. So spark up some devil's lettuce and get ready to dive into Danny Sode's journey from teen stoner to comedy king. From his small-town roots to destroying comedy clubs across America, Dan's journey has been a roller coaster of crass humor that leaves crowds crying with laughter. Get ready to explore how this mischievous prankster became the acclaimed cult comedy leader he is today. We'll unpack Dan's creative process for crafting his signature brand of chaos and highlight some of his most legendary bits. Strap in, because getting to know Dan Soder is one hell of a ride. Our story starts in 1983 when a comedic monster named Dan Soder was born in Hartford, Connecticut on June 24th. Raised in the quiet suburbs of Aurora, Colorado as an only child, far from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, Dan grew up in the suburbs with his mother. Dan was a natural-born troublemaker and an odd duck from the start, pulling pranks on teachers and friends. He'd dress up like his teachers and torture classmates with flatulence. Real mature stuff. Dan's pranks landed him in detention more than math class. But hey, at least it gave him material to ace the comedy game. Little did Dan know, this mischievous streak would later translate into a talent for crafting chaos on stage. His upbringing in the trash fire that was 90 seconds Long Island shaped his entire comedic perspective. All the feminine values his mother tried to teach fell on deaf ears as young Dan got pulled into the realm of comedy, thanks to the rough around the edges styles of George Carlin, Sam Kinison, and other iconic offenders of decency from that era. They showed little Dan that being rude, crude, and socially unacceptable was the path to comedy gold. By age 12, while other boys were playing Little League, Dan was memorizing routines by the greats like George Carlin and Bill Hicks and idolizing Mad Magazine. Misfortune and tragedy struck poor Dan when he was still in high school. His father passed after suffering through a long illness, and merely 2 years later, his sister passed away in a car crash. However, these childhood traumas did not stop Dan from becoming the lovable comedian he is today. After graduating high school, Soder went to Alaska to live with his aunt. He then found a job at a cannery working on the dock crew sorting the fish brought in from fishermen. He would often mix up the fish, causing a huge inconvenience for the rest of the staff. Being able to do things correctly though meant a lot to Dan. There was one incident where his boss had a large piece of metal equipment dropped on his foot. Dan found this humorous. While at the cannery, Dan would learn how to drink and test his limits, smoke weed in creative ways, like heating up 2 knives and burning the herb with them, sneaking into the dormitory without paying rent. Dan felt this experience was the first time he interacted with real men and appreciated any validation they gave him. He also learned that he was not meant for this environment. He looks back at the time as the place where he discovered he is funny, as he was able to make hardened Alaskan people laugh, which is not easy to do. Soder decided he needed to go back to college after working there because he did not want to go there anymore. He attended Ithaca College after leaving an Arizona university. He started hitting up every open mic night within driving distance, working tirelessly to hone his vulgar craft. The first few years were full of bombs and busts as he searched for his voice, but the seeds of comedy had already been planted. Now it was just a matter of time for Dan to take the stage himself. Those first years on the scene were rough, folks. While working day jobs as a preschool janitor and TGI Fridays bathroom attendant, Soder spent nights bombing hard at any dingy dive that would let him spew his vulgarities. At just 15, Dan hit the stage for the first time in Denver, effortlessly poking fun at his metalhead teen years. He was hooked like a trout. Dan had found his people, fellow weirdos who spun pain into punchlines. For Dan, the experience was intoxicating. The spotlight called to him, fueling his drive to pursue comedy full-time. But first, he had to survive high school. Dan's energetic persona made him sociable, though at times also led to mischief. Through high school, Dan kept sharpening his act at local clubs, workshopping his stories of detention hall disasters and dating blunders. After barely surviving the grueling academics of Ithaca Community College, Dan was ready to skip school forever and dive headfirst into comedy. He started hitting up every open mic night within driving distance, honing his craft anywhere he could find a stage, a mic, and a bemused audience. Dan had set his sights on the comedy mecca, New York City. At age 20, he made the daunting move out east armed with nothing but a suitcase of hoodies, a bong, and a head full of jokes. The first few years were full of bombs and busts as Dan searched for his voice, but his persistently crass material and IDGAF attitude eventually started killing in seedy clubs across NYC. Early on, Dan experimented with different styles searching for his voice, but soon he realized the best laughs came when he fully embraced his reckless, no-holds-barred attitude on stage. Dan hit the open mics hard, quickly making waves with his loose, conversational riffing style. He shared hilarious stories covering his stoner lifestyle, family drama, bombing on stage, anything for a laugh. But soon, brutal reality hit Dan like a ton of bricks. Waiting hours just to perform 5 minutes was grueling. Dan couch surfed to save money and passed out flyers, determined to make it an NYC's packed comedy scene. The grind was on. After a decade honing his act, Dan would finally get the big break he had been waiting for. In his early days, Dan experimented with different on-stage personas. He tried out characters and one-liners, seeing what stuck with audiences. Over time, Dan realized the best comedy came when he embraced his true, uncensored self. He leaned into his brash attitude and knack for chaotic storytelling. On stage, Dan transforms into a lovably reckless goofball. He contagiously giggles like a baked hyena at his own bits, making the crowd crack up before he even delivers the punchline. Dan's carefree style creates an intimate, conversational vibe. He openly shares embarrassing stories, from bombing on stage to drunk escapades gone wrong. By highlighting his flaws, Dan makes audiences feel like they're laughing with a friend. His authenticity quickly made him a fan favorite. Fans know a Dan Soder routine will take them to hilariously dark places. On stage, Dan unleashes a verbal diarrhea of runway thoughts, riffing and tangenting wherever his wild mind takes him. No topic is off limits for Dan to plunge into his own chaotic vortex of humor. Dan's willingness to bare his twisted soul and dive into taboo territories keeps crowds cackling. Fans never know where his wild mind will take them next. From deranged cops to cannibal chickens, they just pray it's not to Dan's dark subconscious. That place is trouble. Fans appreciate Dan's talent for unexpected storytelling. On stage, Dan improvises creativity guided by his interests. His goal is simply finding humor, not offending. Using exaggerated scenarios and extroverted personalities, Dan crafts absurd situations, leaving crowds joyous. Profile stories describe Dan's comedic mind exploring everyday scenarios through unpredictable perspectives. Skits involving fictitious characters playing off circumstances provide laughs through imagination rather than shock. Dan invites laughter through lively exaggeration of familiar norms. Performances showcase enthusiastic wit crafting amusement from life's unusual moments. Fans enjoy discoveries of Dan's enlivened perspective. Once he slithered his way into Manhattan, things started happening fast for all dirtbag Dan. Gigs at Gotham Live and Comic Strip Live had him blowing up like Chernobyl. Soon, that Truddy sketch show came knockin', and it was there Soder's unhinged improv talents truly shined. I mean, this dude would go so off script that the censors had PTSD flashbacks trying to bleep it all. Audiences were hooked on Soder's aggressive bro humor approach. With that show, he shattered through to the big time and made degeneracy destigmatized. After years on the grind, Dan's talents blossomed in New York's cutthroat comedy clubs. He scored a regular spot on the popular Whiplash show, honing his voice alongside rising stars like Kumail Nanjiani. After paying his dues on NYC's cutthroat comedy circuit, Dan became a killer comedian and made his TV debut on Conan in 2013. Dishing his love of weed and redemption stories. Dan argued comedy shouldn't just be about cutting people down, but also about building people up through hilarious stories of rebirth and redemption. Man, Dan's career exploded when Comedy Central aired his first hour-long stand-up special, which was ironically called Not Special, in 2016, and thus exposing his chaos to huge new audiences. His 2019 special Son of a Gary cemented his status as a Comedy Central favorite. The special spotlighted Dan's talent for transforming mundane topics into roller coasters of hilarity. He riffed on meet and greets, fast food orders, and run-ins with the cops, sending the crowd into fits. After a decade on stage, Dan had developed a sharp comedic muscle that was ready to kick down the doors of showbiz. He was ready to unleash his special brand of chaos to wider audiences, After achieving success on Those Who Can't, Dan Soder took his career up a huge notch. He started getting roles in major Hollywood films like I Hate Kids and Pop Star, Never Stop Never Stopping, exposing him to even bigger audiences. Meanwhile, his stand-up dates were selling out theaters nationwide as his fan base continued expanding rapidly. Soder also began co-hosting popular comedy podcasts that further blurred the lines between his outrageous humor and private personality. It was on these podcasts that Soder's true talents as a conversationalist really shined through, whether riffing with friends on Comedy Bang Bang or dissecting current events on Matt and Shane's secret podcast. Soder displays an effortless wit and knack for steering any discussion into hilarious, uncomfortable territories. His unhinged live commentary during episodes added so much off-the-cuff hilarity. Listeners became addicted to Soder's unfiltered brand of guy talk comedy in all its crude, un-PC glory. Moreover, with his guest appearances on shows like The Roast of Charlie Sheen and him being a co-host of podcast Reasonable Doubt with Mark Norman, there was no stopping this guy from conquering the hearts of comedy lovers all over. And it comes as no surprise that he was given the new Comic of the Year honor from Comedy Central. Never one to hold back, Dan flirts with taboo topics, stirring controversy with the perpetually offended, but he argues that keeping audiences on their toes prevents comedy from getting stale and politically correct. While Dan's material has evolved with more nuance, he still refuses to censor himself. His goal is to remind audiences not to take life so seriously. Dan enjoys flying so close to the sun that he often crashes and burns. But like a comedy Icarus, he refused to have his wings of wit clipped by the cancel culture cops. For hardcore comedy nerds, Dan also hosts the Bonfire podcast alongside Big J. Okerson. The duo's off-the-cuff banter and comic chemistry have built them a cult following. The man is, simply put, a comedic savant who operates on a higher plane of hilarity. Thanks to Comedy Central, Dan's reach grew exponentially, but he maintained his edgy, conversational tone, staying true to his comedic roots. Dan continues fearlessly expanding his creative horizons. He explored acting with a recurring role on Billions and guest spots on shows like The Jim Gaffigan Show. Of course, Soder's messy style of humor has been accused of going too far or wasn't funny by some crybaby critics. Some less than amused folks saw him dredging up subjects simply to offend rather than aiming for true comedy. But as the fans know, going too far is Soder's specialty. PSHHH. How else would we know we've truly lived without making someone's feelings hurt? While his style evolved to stay fresh, it never became any less depraved, much to the dismay of woke scolds everywhere. Hell, in today's soft society, Soder seems to relish ruffling feathers even more by nowadays saying the quiet things loud. And you know what? That's American as apple pie fellas. This madman will never conform to the PC police state. Dan insists his intent is simply to push the boundaries of what's acceptable in pursuit of the funniest truths. He'll be the first to admit some old bits were groaners, but insists life's too short to not laugh at it all. During the height of cancel culture in recent years, Soder almost seemed to relish ruffling feathers with his disrespectful material even more. Still, Soder insists he's an equal opportunity offender who aims jokes at everyone fairly, especially himself. Through self-deprecating anecdotes, he frequently reminds fans that his intent is simply pushing nonsense to its illogical limits for laughs rather than pushing any harmful agendas. In the end, Dan Soder pushes artistic boundaries because true comedy for him comes from churning societal norms into butter. So if you want a comic who serves up utmost outrageousness with dinner, he's your guy. So whether blasting podcasts or prepping his next special, you better believe Soder will keep tormenting Twitter with his outrageous antics and haughty disregard for rules. And thank God for that, because without fearless freaks like him, comedy just wouldn't be the same. As he matured, Dan's material evolved to reflect his changing worldview. While still bringing the funny, Dan's newer material shows more nuance and thoughtfulness. He's touched on heavier topics like addiction and mental health issues with levity and heart, opening up about his own struggles. Dan also spares no one. He mocks his own privilege as a white man and satirizes societal double standards. And while he still loves spinning raunchy yarns, it's clear Dan now thinks harder about the impact and message behind his comedy. His evolution shows comedians can grow without sacrificing funny. While maturing, Dan realized some old bits had not aged so finely like chunky milk left in a hot car, so he evolved beyond his early over-reliance on shock value and focused more on mocking society's certified clowns. He realized life hands out lemons that aren't always so ripe for joke pickin'. Dan made his mark on comedy with his authenticity, work ethic, and refreshing honesty. He inspired comics to keep grinding and find their own voice. Over his career, Dan Soder has left an indelible mark on stand-up comedy. His authenticity and gift for storytelling appeal to newcomers and veterans alike. Younger comics look to Dan's DIY work ethic in the early days as inspiration to keep grinding. Meanwhile, comedy greats admire how Dan crafted his own unique lane with his absurdist humor and conversational tone. Dan's also known for supporting up-and-coming comedians. He often features openers on his tours and gives them a huge platform to display their talents. Comedy vets respect how Dan carved his own unique lane. He's considered a comedian's comedian, someone who takes the craft seriously. Dan constantly works to improve and tries out new styles, from acting to podcasting, and he uses his platform to showcase rising talent. He's constantly working to improve and experimenting with new formats like acting and podcasting. He'll try any microphone that will have him. Park benches, drive-thrus, cop cars. The man just wants to bring the funny. From his role on Billions to regular drops by the Joe Rogan Experience, Dan continues reaching new audiences with his unfiltered brand of hilarity. His specials like Son of a Gary and Son of a Gary Part 2 earned him widespread critical acclaim. Dan continues expanding his horizons, exploring acting too to showcase rising talent. Dan knew he couldn't keep all the big applesauce to himself, so he launched the network to put the next generation of comedy on the map. No matter what new frontiers he explores, Dan's loyalty is to the joke above all else. He continues crafting new ways to unleash his inner comedy chaos and bring levity to the world. Whether riffing on relationships or reptilians, Soder's mission remains the same. Destroy sacred cows and leave audiences in stitches. Above all, Dan Soder's legacy is the community he's built through laughter. During his specials, Dan transforms the crowd into a pack of giggling, gasping friends. His relatable stories of humiliation and triumph remind us we're all just weird humans trying our best. No topic is off limits if it gets audiences chuckling together. Dan's goal is simple: spread chaos and joy. Even during painful times, Dan's warped perspective and contagious laugh remind us not to take life too seriously. After a Dan Soder show, audiences leave with cheeks sore from smiling and bellies aching from cackling. Though the world is crazy, Dan proves we can face it with a twisted smile, and we just sometimes need to let it all loose to truly enjoy the moment, regardless of all the chaos in the back of our heads. The way Dan narrates his own struggles in a humorous manner is proof that we can take something ugly and make something beautiful out of it. His willingness to share painful stories reminds us we're all just flawed humans. Dan's contagious laugh and warped worldview teach audiences not to take life too seriously. Dan Soder has cemented his legacy as one of comedy's most creative cult leaders. His willingness to share embarrassing stories reminds us we're all just flawed humans. Dan's contagious cackle teaches audiences not to take this insane world so seriously. He proves that true comedy comes from shaking off censorship and letting one's freak flag fly freely. So if you want to support a comic breaking the mold, doing it his way, be sure to catch Soder's upcoming projects. We just scratched the surface of the madness and mayhem of Dan Soder, so whether you're a longtime Soder head or new to his antics, I think we can all agree this dude is a special kind of funny that the comedy world desperately needs. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go bleach my brain after summarizing his act. Let us know your favorite Soder bits in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and bang the notification bell to join our happy YouTube family and join me down in the comedy sewer where the real party is. Now go enjoy the gift of laughter that Dan has given the world. Stay strange out there, you wonderfully weird rebels. Dan Soder would be proud.